The challenge is everything gets recorded.
So like the wild west of technology, but let's talk a little bit about AI from your perspective.
There was a lawsuit recently, an individual who had been, in a criminal lawsuit, had been indicted. In preparation to talk with his lawyer, went online to ChatGPT to frame his legal argument.
Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it. And
Right.
I think that's how we should look at the use of AI. Their brain activity was much lower than those that with the old-fashioned way, which tells you it's lazy.
Tune in for today's episode of the Leadership Lab Clarity Special Edition.
Well, thank you for joining me for another episode of the Leadership Lab. You'll notice it's a little different this time because we're doing a special edition here from our 5th annual user summit here in Laguna Beach, California. And so I'm really excited to be able to bring on some guests that are here with us to discuss everything about data, doctors, and leadership through the eyes of the patient. And that's really, really critical. On a previous episode, I had Dr. Cozy here, and he really gave me that idea to really put that through the eyes of the, because that's very, very important. So to that point, I want to say welcome, Scott Moore, a longtime friend, actually,
Yep.
And a very smart, prolific attorney here in the healthcare space. And so, Scott, welcome to another to the Leadership Lab.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Very glad you're here. Well, let's introduce you to those who may not know you that are watching here. Sometimes we get caught up in our work here, and so we just think that everybody knows us, but there's a vast world out there and people that are talking through that don't. But introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, sure. So, been an EMT now for just over almost 37 years. Started.
These we're all getting older.
Yeah, became an EMT after I dropped out of college and didn't quite know what I wanted to do. My mother was ill at the time, and so I needed to stay close to home. So started working on an ambulance in the Metro Boston area, worked my way up into a leadership role there. I was a director of operations, and then decided to go back on the truck full time to go get my college degree, and then went to law school. And I spent a couple of years at the Department of Labor while I was in law school, and then after law school, and then sort of had the bug was still there. I was working for my my fire department in my hometown. I did that for almost 18 years, but I got back into EMS and spent some time as the CEO of one of the larger ambulance services in the Boston area, and then started my own consulting and law firm probably about 11 years ago now. And then this past January of 25, merged my firm with Brian Werfel and Chris Kelly, and now we have 5 lawyers and do EMS law I'm on the human resources employment side, and then Brian and the others on Medicare and compliance and sort of all things EMS.
Well, I love that because it's been nice to synergize with now Werfel Moore and Kelly for our annual summit that we do for our users, and this is our 5th year doing that. And so it's just been interesting how paths cross and connect. But I want to kind of get into the meat of some of the conversations that we're having here. And that's kind of the theme of our conference this year, is really talking about last year when we were in Charleston, we talked a lot about data. We had a lot of individuals come in and really talk to us about data. And this time I've had a focus on the physicians because I really believe that the healthcare reform, that really this transformational care that needs to happen, not just in the EMS, but on the national stage. This is what we're seeing from this administration. We're seeing from HHS. We have Kim Brandt is keynoting our conference as well, talking about the use of AI. But being an attorney is really important. We're actually had a panel where we talked about kind of the legal perspective of AI and how that's morphing. But from your background, and of course, everybody's talking about artificial intelligence right now, and AI is the new buzzword, but actually AI has been around for a while.
Yeah.
But let's talk a little bit about that in your experience and what you're beginning to see, because it's kind of it's like the wild west of technology. But let's talk a little bit about AI and from your perspective, kind of some of the logical things that people need to start paying attention to through the eyes of the attorney when we're talking about AI.
Yeah, so I think of AI very much like I think about social media, right? Social media was kind of unleashed on the population. It was adopted very, very quickly, and now we're starting to see some of the fallout of that, right? Recently, some lawsuits where folks were successful in recovering from some of the major social media brands because of unintended consequences or unforeseen, maybe to some degree. I think with AI and,
So let's talk about that. I don't mean to interrupt you there, but for some of that are listening to, tell one of the two stories where these lawsuits have been successful. There may be some people that don't really, because unfortunately, not everybody knows, or they're not researching. They're just in there, and that's kind of some of the unintended. But explain the story, what we're talking about.
Yeah,
here.
so the lawsuits, and I'm not familiar with every detail, but essentially, the lawsuit really was framed around, sort of Facebook and TikTok and some of the other social media sites that were really sort of targeting young minds, right? And for my kids, I have an 18 and a 20-year-old. One's in college and one's getting ready to go to college. For me, social media is something that I will lose an hour just watching, reels or scrolling through, doom scrolling, right? But for my kids, it's part of the fabric of their existence, right? There is no separation between what's happening in their lives in real time and then what's happening online in social media. And so in these instances, there were unfortunately one child that had died by suicide, and others who had just really suffered. I know I was listening to some statistics on the way in about young people aren't even going out on dates anymore because all of their interactions have been through social media rather than in person. So the lawsuits really, no one had been successful in recovering or winning a judgment against any of the platforms, because essentially folks were saying, like, look, there's some assumption of the risk, but really when it comes down to it with teenagers, there's really no ability for them to teens are not exactly known for keeping a governor on their behavior. And so I think this was the first time that we saw these platforms get held accountable. And, I think, part of that is a parenting issue, and some of that is a platform issue, because there's no question that I will lose myself for 2 or 3 hours watching some doom scrolling reel, and I'm a grown up mostly. And so what we're seeing now, though, with AI, and I'm starting to see it in the employment context because of my focus is in HR, where we're seeing folks who are utilizing AI. They're using AI to help them draft, let's say, for example, disciplinary documents or termination documents. And as a result of those, them using an open sourced AI, they're disclosing information that might otherwise be confidential. There was a lawsuit recently where an individual who had been in a criminal lawsuit had been indicted, and in preparation to talk with his lawyer, went online and to ChatGPT to frame his legal argument. And when the prosecutor sought to discover the information used in an open source AI, the lawyer went to move that it was privileged because he was framing his legal arguments and working with his attorney, and he lost the case. And because they said essentially the presence of a third party, in legal terms, presence of a third party destroys privilege, and they said essentially this open source AI was in fact the presence of a third party. Now, had the lawyer instructed the defendant to do it, maybe that would have been a different result. But I think, this is one of those things where, and I consider it every single time I draft an outline or something like that my information's being used to train the artificial intelligence as well. And so you just have to be cognizant of that.
I want to kind of segue off of what you just talked about, because there was, and I don't think we really understand the reasons why, but in the One Big Beautiful Bill that was passed, there was a lot of discussion when they were actually going through the deliberative process around should the federal government come in and set regulation around the use of artificial intelligence. And there was a really big issue when it came over to the city. Of course, it was such a large bill. Many of the congressmen and women that actually agreed to it on the House, and it went over to the Senate, didn't read all the language.
Right.
And that's where there became this issue about states' rights and states saying, wait a minute, this is a violation of the 10th Amendment, and we need to be able to actually set our own precedents in our own states. So this is the question I want to ask you, because we are in the wild, wild west of AI. And we're starting to see a lot of lawsuits beginning to file now. We're starting to see states begin to take that up and say we need to put some constraints around the use of it, how it is used, or what have you. Is it really functional to have states put in all of these different parameters and how you're going to work? Or really should it be something that we should have considered as Americans to allow the federal government to do? And I know that's scary to talk about, and it might be controversial, but I'd really like to know your opinion on what you think.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The EU implemented regulations around the use of AI and have created a council essentially where they're going to go through and, parts of it have already become effective, but a large portion of it becomes effective in November of 26. But they've essentially created a council to start studying, getting experts to figure out exactly, we don't quite fully understand, right? The people who created AI have said that there are deep concerns for what AI may yield as a result long term. And so I think the challenge with the states issue are when you're, the world, I'm licensed in 3 states. And one of the challenges that I have is that the practice of law is not tremendously different in the different states. One of the, Brian, who does, Werfel, who does the Medicare, Medicare is really the same regardless of where you are in the country. With much of the stuff that I do from an HR consulting side or from the employment law side, very different. I mean, there's some themes, right? History, it doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. And so
we're in California too, so it's very different here.
And California is a place where, I often tell my clients, I say, look, you may want to hold off on hiring someone from California because the rules here in the state are really very restrictive. Now, again, that's what the voters in California have voted in. However, I think at least as we think about the law, the federal law sets the floor, right? And then the states have the right to legislate more restrictively. And I think it's important that we at least have some threshold protections and limits around the use of AI. And then if the states want to do something higher, the challenge is one of the reasons why we have federal law, right? Because it's very challenging to expect, let's say, a business that's multi-state to have to address maybe what could be, 3, 4, 10, 15 different states' laws. And I do this with clients who are multi-state. I have to go through and make sure that, their handbooks and their employment policies are all...
You do that for us.
That's right. Yeah. And so I think, I do think it would be great to have a threshold because I think, there do need to be some baseline protections for not only the people using the AI, right, but then also the AI organizations, because to some degree, my concern is that for many of us, this got adopted very quickly, right? For a lot of folks, they weren't. For many listening to the program, I guarantee you, 4 years ago they weren't using AI.
No.
I mean, other than spell check or one of this. But
I think it was Grammarly at the time, or something like something,
right. Yep.
Whatever.
Yep.
And then once they OpenAI came out, or ChatGPT is what most people remember. It was like. It was, and I remember people saying, this is scary. We should do this. I don't know if we're ready for this.
Yep.
But they opened it up and in people dove.
Yeah.
And
I was going to say there was an attorney, I think in the state of New York, who got disciplined by the bar for citing a case that actually clearly he'd used one of the open sourced AIs, and it was a Law and Order case from the television show, right? And so, one of the things we say to folks is it's a good place to start. You need to understand what tool you're using. You need to understand whether that tool is an open or a closed source tool, and then understand how folks in your organization, because if you think they aren't, they 100% are. I know 2 years ago when I went to my daughter's school, there was a no use of AI in the classroom. Now, this year, they have an AI major. Yeah. That's 2 years. They went from you may not use it to we have an AI major now, because they're realizing that it is inevitable, and it's better that you understand how to use it and what the risks are associated with its use, and then use it in a way, because there are many ways in which you can really save a lot of time and a lot of money, but you do have to make sure that the human piece will never be removed. And we've seen that in healthcare claims, and even in auditing. I guarantee you, I know when I was at the United States Department of Labor, we had something called targeting runs, and it was a program that went through and looked at Form 5500s from retirement plans and welfare plans, and it would identify, based upon preset parameters, employer submissions that had potential problems, and those were kicked out for audits, right? And so I think we will see more and more and more of that as it matures and continues to get adopted.
To me, I think it's amazing. I want to ask another question because I could talk about this all day long about just how there's so much advantage to using AI that I'm not going to focus on. Of course, everybody does good and evil. I was speaking to the emergency physicians last week in Charleston, literally relative to AI and the intersection of healthcare finance. And so it's just understanding how we think about this through, and as a lawyer, you kind of say, is it legal or is it ethical? Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it. And I think that's how we should look at the use of AI. But I want to go over to privacy because there is a case that has been filed because of the ambient AI that people are using. I think is amazing and critical for clinicians that are using this right now. It helps free them up from having to do stuff and do more patient care. So I like where that context is. But the privacy laws are very interesting about the intersection of that. And this lawsuit that's been filed, it's kind of 2 class action lawsuits that we're all following that's happening here in the state of California related to ambient AI. Talk to me about that intersection. This came up on a call. And the reason why I'm saying this came up on a call that I was having with some friends from CMS and Socio. And this was just off the record. We were kind of having a conversation. And it was relative to y'all should really be paying attention to the privacy part of things. As well. So what's your take on that? I know you probably have been looking into it because this is a big HR issue as well. So I'd really love to understand.
I think it also comes around, like we're working a lot and doing a ton right now around body-worn cameras, right? And so, when I'm talking at home about wanting a new pair of shoes and later on Facebook, I see an ad for shoes, my wife's like, doesn't that trouble you? And I said, well, no, I'm 56. Like I forget that I actually wanted that. And I'm glad that it helps me. For many people, that's concerning. And I will say that I think when it comes down to things like my wife is a primary care doc, former EMT, now a physician, and they have a scribe, an AI scribe in the office while she's seeing patients that just picks up from the moment the visit starts through. One of the challenges that we have with some of that is, number one, that when people are intentionally recording things like, and I say this to clients about if you're holding or taking meeting minutes, if you're using AI for the purpose of meeting minutes, the challenge is everything gets recorded, right? When you're taking handwritten or typewritten meeting, you record actions that were taken, maybe motions or discussions. And so I tell clients that after you've approved the minutes from your last meeting, destroy the recording. That should be your policy, right? Because again, the approved minutes are, in fact, the legal minutes. But if it does exist, it can be discovered, right? So when it comes down to some of the privacy issues that I see here, is one, if folks don't know that, that there's a recording going on or that the AI is picking up, I think it's important that they do understand that. I think there should be disclosures by all. And in fact, we're seeing this again, just like with body-worn cameras. Oftentimes I think the first thing you should do is announce, listen, there is not only audio, but video recording going on. Now, depending upon the state you're in, there are one-party or two-party consent states. My state is a two-party consent, or it's actually a knowledge rather than a consent. Presumably you walk away if you don't consent. But in many states, it's a single-party consent, which means, and which I sort of smile at because usually one party always knows it's being recorded, right? But again, I think it comes down to, and this is we're preparing a checklist. Our firm's starting to build some tools around the use of AI, and it's really inventorying your team, all of your team members, to find out where it's being used, right? Because when I'd say to EMS leaders before, hey, I guarantee you your staff are using canned narratives that are recorded on your tablet PCRs, that they're just dropping in. That's not a good thing.
Right.
And so they'd said, no, there's no way they're doing it.
Oh, yes, they are.
And I'd say, pull in all your tablets. I guarantee you there's 4 or 5 sort of canned, a shortness of breath narrative, a chest pain narrative, whatever. And so this really comes down to having an open and honest conversation. Tell people, listen, we're a judgment-free zone. We just want to know how you're using it, because I will venture to bet probably 90% of people in your average service are using AI in some form or fashion. And for example, if they're going to ChatGPT for the purposes of asking, geez, what's the appropriate dosage for a pediatric patient? Again,
or they're using Claude or they're using Perplexity. There's so many AI components out there right now, Scott, that people are using that we need to be. So I love that you're doing that. The firm's getting involved, because I think it's going to be ever evolving, and it's going to be changing rapidly. And so you have to think about whatever policy you have. These are probably policies that you're going to be updating in frequency. Yeah. You're going to have many versions of it.
This won't be once a year. This will be once a month. You need to revisit the policy.
Yeah. It's like what we're doing on our end. We're like, at least once a quarter right now, but it could be even quicker just because things are moving so quickly. I know we're kind of getting towards the end here with the podcast, but I want to ask you kind of a question that I ask every single person that shows up on my podcast, and I want to know, what keeps Scott Moore up at night? What's one thing that keeps Scott Moore up at night?
I want to say workforce, because I'm still an EMT, and I am deeply concerned about the ability for, I've done ambulance calls in the middle of Missouri where 2 ambulances cover almost 1,300 square miles. And I always worked in an area that we had 4 level 1 trauma centers and 4 interventional cath labs within 5 minutes, 10 minutes of anywhere I ever worked. I am very worried for the 90% of ambulance service, or really 75% that do less than 500 trips a year. So there will be parts of this country where that just doesn't exist. But I will say, keeping on the AI theme, I am deeply concerned that we will take away a field provider's critical ability to think, because, humans will almost always take the path of least resistance. And what I say to folks are, if EMTs or paramedics stop knowing how to take a blood pressure, we wouldn't just give them blood pressure machines. We'd make sure that they knew how to take a blood pressure, right? Because you need to treat the patient, not the machine. And I worry that because AI will get adopted in nearly every facet of healthcare, and even in the provision of healthcare, that we use it as an aid to assist better medicine, and not as a way to do medicine cheaper, or as a way to take, we're seeing NPs and PAs are now, as my wife will say, while they're wonderful, they're not physicians, right? They have almost 4 less years of training. And so they're not synonymous. They're great. I see a PA myself, and it's wonderful, but it's using the right tool in the right place at the right time.
At the right time. And I think that was probably and I'm going to close it here, but I think you hit the nail on the head about losing the critical thinking skills that AI is going to take, because we're going to get lazy. And in your backyard at MIT, they released a study last year about, they did 3 different cohorts of individuals. One where they did an EEG on the different cohorts. One was where they only gave them the ability of that old way that we grew up. We had to go to libraries and research and read. They had another cohort that actually did the World Wide Web. They could Google something, look, research, plus use the library, whatever. And then the last cohort was a group that only used the AI stuff. And the EEGs definitely showed that the individuals that were with the large language models, the LLMs, had their brain activity was much lower than those that went the old-fashioned way, which tells you it's lazy. And that's where I get a little concerned. I'm excited about the AI, but this new generation now, that all they've grown up on, as you talked about earlier, all this stuff here, they're going to be looking at AI. I've seen it. It's very easy to just go to Claude and say, tell me what to do here, and you never do anything else, whatever there. So I could go on a tangent about that, but thank you for bringing that up. We did not prepare this. No. I loved it. We didn't even have an outline, folks, just so you know. This was really a last-minute thing, and thank you so much, Scott, for joining me here on the Leadership Lab. We'll have to do this again.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you having me.
You bet.
things.